Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on this special stream. My guests today are Matthew Hartke and Bram Rawlings. And the question we're asking today is, was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? Do the New Testament documents show that Jesus and his followers believed that he would return in their lifetimes? And do the later New Testament documents reflect that the early church was coping from Jesus's failed return? With me is Matthew, who is a former Christian and a student of Christian origins, and his answer would be yes. That the church was suffering from a kind of cognitive dissonance. And then I also have with me Bram, who is a student of Christian origins and into historical apologetics, and they both have wrote extensively on this particular topic. And so I'm really excited to have both you guys on tonight. And so for starters, I would like both of you to just maybe briefly share what got you interested in this topic, and then outline your particular theory regarding this question, and then we'll dive into the nitty-gritty and get into all the text and all that fun stuff. So Matt, why don't you go ahead and lead us off here?
Okay, yeah. Well, my background, I grew up in a very devout Pentecostal / charismatic environment, an environment that placed a really heavy emphasis on the end times or eschatology, but from a mostly dispensational perspective. And I grew up in that environment believing really strongly that I was living in the last generation, that Jesus was going to come back within our lifetime. And, you know, that you could look around and see prophecies starting to, become fulfilled all around us. But, getting from that belief, that worldview to where I am now, it's a long story, but I think an important milestone. I was 16 years old, walked into a bookstore, and I was a really big fan of C.S. Lewis at the time, and I was looking for basically anything I could find from Lewis. And I ran across this book. It's a collection of essays from Lewis, but it's called The World's Last Night. And that's the main essay in the book is called The World's Last Night. And I was really surprised. I mean, it was Lewis was basically explaining his views on eschatology, but it was from a very different perspective from the kind of popular American dispensationalism that I grew up with. But it was also surprising because he was interacting with Albert Schweitzer, and Schweitzer was, probably the biggest popularizer, at least in the academic world, for the view that Jesus was actually a failed apocalyptic prophet, that he expected the end to come. And we might have to clarify, talk about the end or the end of the world or Parousia and things like that as we get into the discussion. But he advocated the view that Jesus expected the end to come in his generation at that time, as they were going up to Jerusalem, and that then the early church, his followers, had to grapple with that failed expectation afterwards. And I mean, that was obviously a hard pill to swallow for me at the time. It was completely contrary to anything that I had ever heard, or the kind of canons of plausibility that I worked with at the time. But I found refuge for a lot of years in the work of N.T. Wright, and especially in Wright's teacher, G.B. Caird at Oxford. Caird had an excellent article called I forget, it was a 1965 article that really kind of started what became known as the third quest for the historical Jesus. But both Caird and Wright really helped me for a long time to kind of try to hold together, trying to read the texts honestly and historically, read the evidence as best I could, and yet still maintain my Christian faith and maintain some kind of orthodoxy. But eventually I came around to bite the bullet and accept the view that, actually I think Schweitzer was right, and Jesus was actually a failed apocalyptic prophet.
Okay. And so, Bram, tell us a little bit about what got you interested in this subject, and maybe a little bit of your background as well, if you want to.
Yeah, well, my story is not nearly as interesting as Matthew's. Really, the question of whether Jesus falsely predicted the end of the world within his own generation was one that had been kind of swirling in the back of my mind for some time, ever since I had been uh, doing resurrection studies and had been reading the works of Dale Allison and so on. Um, like Matthew, I kind of held N.T. Wright's "this was all fulfilled in AD 70" theory for a while, just as kind of a placeholder. But it wasn't until really the past few months that I started to try to tackle this question head on, and I've changed my views a lot, and I've learned a lot, and it's been a really fun journey for me. And I'm sure there's a lot more that I have to learn. So I'm really excited to be here with Matthew, who's been doing this for longer than I have, and I think we're going to have a great conversation.
Awesome. So Matt kind of sketched out his view just a little bit. Obviously, your view would just be, no, he's not a failed apocalyptic prophet. But you want to give us kind of like what would differentiate, maybe in a nutshell, differentiate your view from like more like a partial preterist view that somebody like Wright would hold?
Yeah, well, so Wright takes the cosmic catastrophe language in the Olivet Discourse as referring to the destruction of AD 70 and the metaphorical enthronement of the Son of Man and so on. And I don't take that view. I think that verses 24 through 27 in Mark 13 are referring to the actual second coming. So I would disagree with people like R.T. France and N.T. Wright on a number of exegetical points. My view falls more in line with people like George Beasley Murray in that sense. As for my own position more generally on this topic, I like to distinguish between two things. One is my views on the argument that Jesus gave a false prediction and that the early church struggled with cognitive dissonance and so on. And I treat that in a separate category as the own model I propose for understanding Christian eschatology. And the former kind of block of thought, I have more confident thoughts about. As for my own model of eschatology, I definitely have my thoughts on that, but they're more tentative. So I would give a number of arguments for saying, no, I don't think that the argument that Schweitzer and Weiss and more modern scholars like Allison and Ehrman make suffice to show that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. But more tentatively, I'd say that the way I understand early Christian eschatology is that neither Jesus nor his earlier followers set any dogmatic deadlines, and that their view of the parousia was more conditional on human behavior. That's a very quick sketch of my view. There's a lot to dig into, but I think that'll suffice for now.
Yeah, no,
I have to butt in for a second and just say, Bram, obviously, I reached out to Eric to set this up because I was just really impressed with the presentation you gave on Exploring Realities channel. And just, this is a conversation that happens, very rarely, I think, in a rigorous and good faith way, but so much of this apologetics and counter-apologetic space with regard to Jesus so often revolves around the questions of very popular level stuff of Jesus mythicism, which I think we both agree is just absolute garbage. So I'm excited to have a conversation like this, which I see as being, a much more serious conversation about something that scholarship is actually very engaged over and has been very engaged with for the last century or more. Really going back to Reimarus, at the beginning of the quest for the historical Jesus. This has been something that's been, at the front edge of the question of Jesus, and that obviously was a big point that Schweitzer was making in his book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. But popular level, or like you look on YouTube, you look on, for like podcasts or anything that, that where this kind of discussion is taking place, it's very rare. So I'm just excited to take place in this kind of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Bram. I'm sorry.
That's all I was going to say. I was just going to say it's an honor. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I really wanted to have both of you guys on. Matthew, you've done a little bit of YouTubing yourself, had a couple of your videos do really, really well. And I do get this question a lot. Was Jesus a failed apocalyptic prophet? And the reason why is, like you said, it's just a very neglected topic in Christian apologetics. And it's usually just brushed aside. And I personally don't find the preterist view of something like France or Wright, or maybe it's not exactly preterism like the Reformed kind of a preterism that we see of like Bonson or Sproul, but yeah, I don't personally find that satisfying as well. And so after I saw the heavy lifting that Bram had done, I just thought, well, this is just a match made in heaven, if you will, Matt. And so that's why I definitely wanted to get you guys on. And so, Matt, why don't you go ahead and just go into, we're going to get into some passages here. But I want you to maybe give a little bit more of a sketch of your view when you're reading, say, the Gospels or the epistles. What is the case for the, I guess, cognitive dissonance kind of coping sort of view that you would hold?
Yeah, well, I mean, if I could just kind of try to express my view in a nutshell, I think I would say that Jesus and his followers believed that history was reaching its climax, that all wrong things would be made right in that generation, meaning that things like the resurrection of the dead, the final judgment, the restoration of Israel, and the restoration of all creation, that those things were just around the corner, in a very real, very concrete, very literal sense. And I would say that from the moment of Jesus's death onward, his followers were forced to grapple with and reinterpret that expectation to various degrees, in order to reduce the dissonance that arose first from his crucifixion, which was really the exact opposite of what they were expecting, and then from the ongoing delay as the years passed into decades, from that point on. But I mean, to kind of give a few quick points that I think really point in that direction. I mean, first of all, I would have to say that a Jewish apocalyptic prophet just makes sense in that time and place. There were, looking roughly 150 years on both sides of Jesus. That was a very common thing. There were apocalyptic prophets and apocalyptic writings all over the place. So it fits historically. But second, I think this view makes the best sense of the earliest layers of the tradition that we have in the Gospels, and in the writings of Paul. And that, just as importantly as those earliest layers of tradition, the later traditions, which seem to try to be making sense of those traditions in a way that is reinterpreted or adjusted from their original meaning. And then I think, if you don't have Jesus as an apocalyptic prophet, you have to make sense of John the Baptist on the one hand, who seems to have been an apocalyptic prophet, and then the early church on the other hand, who seems to have been, Paul especially seems to have been thoroughly apocalyptic in their thinking. And so, the kind of the missing link between John the Baptist and Paul to say that Jesus wasn't an apocalyptic prophet, when, both the movement that he came out of, the John the Baptist movement, and the movement that came out of him, the early Jesus movement, seem to have been apocalyptic. That doesn't seem as credible as the alternative. But I think finally, and this is difficult because it's kind of the most important point in my mind, but I recognize that it might take us too far afield for this kind of conversation. But I don't think that the birth of Christianity and, how it took the particular shape that it did, I don't think that it's adequately explainable without that prior eschatological expectation. It really is, in my mind, the key that unlocks everything. This is a point that Dale Allison makes, but questions like, why did the earliest Christians interpret their experience of Jesus after his death to mean that he had physically risen from the dead and that he was at the right hand of God in heaven? Resurrection wasn't the obvious choice to explain that kind of thing. And obviously I'll have to say this is a point of order, because I think that we are going to possibly in this conversation run into a lot of questions about dating and how exactly to appraise. I mean, I know that you, Eric, are a fan of the maximalist case, and so have a very high view of the reliability of the gospel accounts. I'm not sure where you fall on all of that, Bram, but it seems like you do probably side more on Eric's side of that. So this kind of thing might not, be as persuasive to you, or it might take our conversation too far afield. But to me, the question of, why the early Christians used the category of resurrection is a salient question. And I think that the best explanation is what Dale Allison gives, and it's that resurrection is a category that they carried into those experiences in the first place because they were fervently expecting the kingdom to come, and that meant, among other things, the resurrection of the dead. And so for them to say things like Paul does, that, Jesus is risen as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The resurrection of Jesus was a way for them to hold on to their prior expectation in the soon coming kingdom of God, and turn it into a feature instead of a bug, or turn Jesus's death into a feature instead of a bug, so that they could hold on to the core of their eschatological worldview.
Just quick clarification, and I'm going to play as neutral as excuse me, I'm hearing an echo of myself. That's, forgive me. I'm going to be as neutral as I can and really let you and Bram kind of hash it out. But as far as the resurrection appearances, Matthew, what do you take those to be? It was like some sort of like visionary or hallucinatory kind of experiences, or are they just, they're interpreting those to deal with some of the dissonance that they had, or it's like a mixture of both? Yeah. Is that probably your view, is a mixture of both?
This is one of the rare places where I would agree with Gary Habermas, in that I think that the hallucination hypothesis doesn't really explain anything, because hallucinations are a symptom and not a cause. If you say that someone hallucinated, you still have to answer the question, why did they hallucinate? And so I would prefer to speak, and also hallucination kind of has a medical kind of overtone to it, where you think, oh, if someone, hallucinations only happen to the, mentally unwell or, psychologically unstable, when that's not really true if you read the literature on hallucinations. But it can be taken pejoratively. And so I'd prefer to just use the language of visions, because that doesn't really carry that same pejorative baggage. But I would say that they experienced dissonance-reducing hallucinations, that they were generated, those visions, those experiences that they had were generated by their need to reduce dissonance over the hard reality of Jesus's death.
Okay. No, that's exactly what I did.
And I would say that for the most part, while some of the, popular ideas about visions where they can't be multisensory or things like that are somewhat overplayed, as I think Dale Allison shows really well. Hallucinations or visions, especially like visions of the recently deceased, they aren't like this kind of Casper thing where it's just, ghosts floating above the ground. Oftentimes they seem very real, and oftentimes they involve both seeing and hearing and or touching, or the feeling, of touching. I still think that most likely the details that emphasize the physicality of the resurrection that you have in like the narratives of Luke and John are legendary accretions, and that the
later embellishments,
and that the earliest, the real historical core probably didn't involve anything to that extent.
Well, my maximal data brain wants to contest you on that, but like
Yep,
I said, I'm going to play neutral here.
Maybe we can have another conversation about that sometime. But.
Yeah, maybe a future date. What I really want to do is talk about some of the passages that probably would have, in your mind, Matthew, created some of these expectations. And so I wanted to have Bram discuss some of these deadline passages that we find both in the Gospels and the Epistles, and give maybe some of his interpretation of how he would see those. And then Matthew, you can go ahead and respond. And then we'll just kind of go back and forth on some of the salient passages that are constantly brought up in this particular conversation.
Well, when we're talking about the earliest layer of apocalyptic expectation, the layer which, on Matthew's view, later Christians had to respond to and kind of cope with, and so on. Usually what's brought up are passages like Mark 9:1, Mark 13:30, Matthew 10:23, and then you get the early letter of 1 Thessalonians, where you apparently have people who are grieving over the delay of the Parousia. You get a passage like 1 Corinthians 7, where on Allison's reading and many other scholars' reading, Paul gives people advice not to marry because the time is short and it's going to come, and it could come any day. So it's those passages which I imagine we agree represent some of the earliest layers of tradition. If I had to kind of do a rapid fire thing, I'd like to go deeper into this because I think this is a crucial place to discuss. Since again, this is the early layer. But if I had to do a rapid fire explanation of these passages, I'd do it like this, and I'm going to try to be quick here. I think Mark 9:1 does, after all, refer to the Transfiguration. I think that all these things in Mark 13:30 are referring to the signs leading up to the Parousia in verses 5 through 23. That's of Mark 13, by the way.
Can I just interrupt real quick? Do you guys think it would be better for us to, like, for Bram to, just say all the passages at once and give his view of those, or for us to go passage by passage?
That'd probably be a better idea. I like the
I think going passage by passage might be better to have a constructive conversation.
Well, let's go for it.
Well, I'll leave it up to you. Which passage do you want to start with?
Probably the biggest one is Mark 9:1. So we can start there.
Sure, I'm gonna flip there really quick just to make sure I stay grounded in the primary sources. So. And he said to them, "Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God after it has come with power." And that's the Markan version, which I think Matthew, elsewhere, you've argued that Matthew, the gospel writer, and Luke are kind of have to tone down, and that maybe you see a form of this passage appear in John 21 and so on. We'll get to all that. But my basic case for why this refers to the Transfiguration is this. One, all three synoptic writers place the Transfiguration immediately after the saying, with an unusually tight chronological link after 6 days. Two, the saying is addressed to some standing here, and only some, Peter, James, and John, actually go up to the Transfiguration Mount. Three, there's a link between the promise that they will see the kingdom of God and what the disciples see at the Transfiguration. So I think Mark, Matthew, and Luke bring this out like this. In Mark, Mark just says he charged them to tell no one what they had seen. Matthew, Jesus says, tell no one the vision. Luke, and they kept silent and told no one in those days of anything of what they had seen. So there's a scene connection. When we see how this tradition is picked up in a later writing, 2 Peter, the writer of 2 Peter associates this event with Jesus's majesty, his honor, his glory. These are royal terms, which is one reason why I don't think it's so unusual for Mark to say in power. And just another smaller link, Matthew says that at the transfiguration that Jesus's face shone like the sun. That's 17 verse 2. And that's language he uses elsewhere in chapter 13, that he connects with the final kingdom in 1343. Maybe just a few more points here. I'm not going to say that that's the only possible interpretation. I think another plausible one is that this saying was fulfilled in the resurrection. And so the some standing here would exclude Judas, which is why the word some is used. And the not taste death part would be alluding to the fact that, Judas had killed himself. And if that's okay, I'm just going to make one more point about the not taste death thing, just to anticipate an objection on Matthew's part. The not taste death thing, so that can mean a few things. It can mean some of you will see the kingdom after others have died off, or it can mean some of you will see the kingdom before you yourselves have died off. And I think the some contrast is between those who would see the kingdom vision before they died and those who would not see the kingdom vision before they died. And moreover, Jesus doesn't say that only some will ever see the kingdom. I think from the context we can deduce that only some will see the kingdom in this way. Only some will see, that is, see the kingdom vision. So yeah, I'd like to get Matthew's response to that and see if we can do a back and forth here.
Awesome.
All right, Matthew, have at it.
Oh, those were some really good points, some of which I haven't heard before, so I really appreciate that. But I think in general, I would say that I'm in a broad agreement about the connection between Mark 9:1, between Jesus saying, "Some of you standing here won't taste death until you see the kingdom of God come with power," and what follows in the following verses. I mean, and I agree that there's a very close connection that Mark seems to be drawing by making that chronological, note. Okay, just 6 days after Jesus said this, the disciples and Jesus Peter, James, and John were standing with Jesus, and he was transfigured before them. It definitely seems like he is making a connection there, but I think it's less obvious what that connection is, or the degree to which Mark regards it as a fulfillment. And I think you also have to distinguish, in all of this conversation, you have to distinguish between the interpretation of the author and the historical Jesus. And obviously that's a really hard distinction to try to make. But that's why there's a difference between gospel studies and historical Jesus studies, is that we can't just assume that what the gospel writers say about Jesus is accurate to the historical Jesus, because, then that's just, a hermeneutic of trust that you're taking. And why are you taking that hermeneutic of trust with the canonical gospels, but not with, say something like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Thomas? You have to get at these things through historical argumentation, but dealing just with what Mark thinks about the transfiguration and its connection to Mark 9:1, to that prediction, I think that it's clear that he sees it as at least a partial fulfillment, as a kind of down payment, or I would say a guarantee, a kind of vouchsafing of Jesus's authority, saying like, what Jesus said in saying that this generation won't pass away, or Mark 13:30, some of you standing here won't taste death until you see the kingdom of God come with power. That is that God kind of puts a stamp on Jesus' authority by showing the disciples Jesus glorified right after that saying, to say like, see, you can trust what he's saying. This is my beloved son. I'm well pleased in him. Take what he says to the bank. But I think that we have to read Mark 9:1 in context, not just to what follows it in the account of the Transfiguration, but also with the verses just preceding. And in the verses just preceding, we read Jesus say, "Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this generation, in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man also will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And then it goes into Mark 9:1, and then he said to them, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who won't taste death until they see the kingdom of God come with power." It seems like the kingdom of God come with power there, it most directly relates with what Jesus was just saying about the coming of the kingdom, or the coming of the Son of Man in the glory of the Father with the holy angels to in judgment, in vindication of those who followed him and in judgment of those who didn't. And Matthew is even more explicit than Mark about the final judgment nature of that. But I think Mark is clear enough that what he's talking about here is the final judgment. And so I think to kind of play up the connection of Mark 9:1 to the Transfiguration, and to make it a stronger connection, you kind of have to move away from the connection that it has with the verses preceding, where it seems like it really is ultimately talking about the eschaton. It really is ultimately talking about the Parousia proper. But I think just one more point about those, some of you won't taste death. I think that most naturally connects with other eschatological sayings in the Gospels where Jesus talks about the messianic woes or the great tribulation that precedes the coming of the kingdom, or the final judgment, and the vindication of Jesus' followers. He expects that tribulation for his followers and the death of some of them will precede the coming of the kingdom. And so I think that in talking about being faithful to him unto death, as the preceding context talks about, is most naturally associated with him saying, some of you here won't die until you see the coming of the kingdom. The implication is, yes, some of you will die in this coming tribulation. Your faith is going to be tested, but stay strong to me, stay committed to my words, and the kingdom is so close that some of you won't die before it actually comes. And so that's what I think makes the most sense.
Yeah, a lot of good.
What would you say? Go ahead, Bram. I was just going to ask, what would you say in response to that?
Yeah, I think you made a lot of good points. I'm going to try to address all of them. So, yes, I agree. I'm not underplaying the connection with the Son of Man coming in judgment starting in 838. That's definitely there. I think if you try to deny that, you're in I don't know what you're doing there. Cognitive dissonance. But the question is, in what way does 9:1 relate to the preceding verses? And I think it functions as a transitional phrase. I think that I think that 838, with you have the Son of Man coming in judgment at the end of time, moves into 9:1, and that at 9:1 Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's shifting their perspective from this time in the future, who knows when, to the time now, and he's saying that at the Transfiguration, the effects of this future kingdom can be felt even now. In other words, the future is going to invade the present even now, without destroying the present, which resembles the very early Christian idea that I think you find in Jesus' ministry itself, of this already not yet eschatology. So in short, I think 9:1 relates to the preceding verses as a transitional phrase. The part about not tasting death, there again, I'd emphasize my point. I have to have notes on me because I don't remember anything, so I apologize if I'm going back and forth.
Oh, no, it's okay.
The point about not tasting death, again, the question is, what contrast is Jesus making there? is he making a contrast between those who would die off before the Parousia came and those who would not die off? Or is he just making a contrast between those who would see this event before their death and those who would not? And I think, the latter is just as plausible, if not more plausible, a reading. By the way, just to anticipate, I hope it's okay to do this, but just to anticipate what we might be talking about in a few minutes, you just mentioned that Matthew seems to actually make the connection between his parallel of Mark 9:1 and the preceding verses stronger. It seems to me that goes directly against this redactional coping theory, where the Gospels are trying to water down Mark's eschatology and so on. So I'll bring that up right now. We're still talking about Mark 9:1, but I think it's an important point to save for later.
Good. We should probably move on to the next one if we want to get to.
Yeah. We could be. If anybody saw the original,
camp out on Mark 1:9:1 all day. Yeah.
Yeah, which I linked in the description. We will probably have to. We'd be here all night, and so. But Bram did a really thorough, longer stream with Van on exploring reality, which I will link in the description later, that you want to check out to unpack for more. I was kind of hoping that we could talk about the Olivet Discourse just a little bit. And then we could maybe get into like 1 Corinthians 7 and 1 Thessalonians 5. And so Bram, I don't want some of the discourse. I want all of it here. Okay, I'm sorry. That was really bad dad joke. But give us a little bit of a rundown on why the Olivet Discourse is supposedly a problem, maybe for our the Christian view, and then we'll have Matt again respond with his thoughts.
Give a rundown of why the Olivet Discourse is a problem.
Well, as far as like where he says that,
he wants you to argue for my view, and then I'll also argue for my view, and yeah.
Not exactly, but or Matthew, if you want to start, as far as like the Olivet Discourse, it seems like Jesus predicts his coming within the disciples' lifetime.
Yeah.
And so just kind of give us maybe a rundown of your view of the passage, and then I will let Bram respond.
I think
it's the first debate I've been hosting, guys, so sorry if I'm a little.
Oh, I don't envy the position that you're in. Yeah.
It's not really a debate; it's a friendly conversation. But yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, go ahead.
I think in talking about Mark 13:30 and obviously the parallels in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, and then I think there's a connection between Mark 13:30 and Mark 9:1, and also with Matthew 10:23, that at least we should just note, and this is a point that Dale Allison makes, but it's that both Mark 9:1, some of you standing here won't taste death until you see the kingdom of God come with power. Mark 13:30, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. And Matthew 10:23, you won't finish going through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Those three sayings all obviously have a very similar structure to them. You have Jesus saying, he prefaces in each one by saying, verily, verily, or amen, or truly I say to you, a point of emphasis. And then he says, something about, some temporal clause of, you won't taste death, or this generation won't pass away, or you won't have finished going throughout the cities of Israel. Then the conjunction until or before Son of Man comes, or the kingdom has come with power, or all these things take place until something occurs. And so the point that Allison makes from this is that it seems like these sayings are all very closely related, and that perhaps they all originate from a single saying. And so just to register that, to put it on the shelf, and because I think it's important to take these, while we have to deal with them each one by one, we should also recognize the similarity between them, and that they take place in similar, seemingly eschatological contexts. in close connection with things like a final judgment or a gathering of the elect, or the cosmic disturbances, et cetera, great tribulation, and so that, I think, is also a point in favor of viewing them all in this apocalyptic way as pointing towards an ultimate end, and not just some kind of inaugurated or realized eschatology point along the way. Even though for some of them, I do think the gospel writers are seeing them in that way. And I think that in particular, Matthew 10:23, some of you, and this is just addressing the point that you just made, Bram, about how the way that Matthew intensifies some of the apocalyptic elements and plays them up in contrast with what you might expect on a kind of delay of the Perusia hypothesis for him to tone them down. I personally think that part of the reason, and I think you actually take this position in your video, and I'm largely in agreement with you here, that Matthew 10:23, the way that Matthew is using that saying, some of you won't have finished going throughout the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes, Matthew actually, in context, sees that fulfilled in the resurrection. That by the time you get to the end of the gospel, Jesus, echoes Daniel 7, saying, I have received, the authority of the kingdom. And then he sends them out to go beyond the borders of Israel to the Gentile world, go preach to the Great Commission in Matthew 28. And so that is a point where I think Matthew's realized eschatology shines through, and he is kind of diffusing that potential bomb by emphasizing the resurrection and the meaning that the early church saw in the resurrection connected with the eschaton. And it's something that I think that point is strengthened by the fact that Matthew doesn't have a return narrative when Jesus sends the disciples out to preach, and he says that you won't have finished going throughout the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. He doesn't, unlike Luke, have picture them returning from that mission. And so Luke doesn't have that saying about them going throughout the cities of Israel, not going throughout the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And he does have them return from that mission. So it seems like, the way that Matthew deals with it is to associate it with realized eschatology, whereas Luke just omits it altogether because he does have the disciples return in his narrative, and it would have made it more problematic. So,
yeah, there's a lot to address there. Well, I guess now that we've kind of fused Matthew...
Sorry, Eric, I knew you said you wanted to talk about the Olivet Discourse, and we just went into Matthew 10.
That's okay. It all kind of strings a little bit together, so go ahead.
Yeah, because you're making Allison's point, and I remember... Oh, my dog just walked in my room. I remember really clearly in Allison's book where he lays out these together and notes the parallels and says, he's not necessarily arguing this, but he's saying it could be that these actually originate from the same saying. Mm-hmm. And the way I'd respond to that is, well, I'm just inherently suspicious of this method of doing surgery on the Gospels like this, and taking these individual sayings and piecing them together, and then without any surrounding interpretive context, saying what they mean. And to make the point that Mark interprets a saying this way, and Matthew interprets a saying this way, and Luke interprets a saying this way, is not to have a hermeneutic of trust. It's rather to say that these gospel writers give us a window into how the early Christians actually originally interpreted these sayings. And therefore, when we find them interpreted this way in the Gospels, that is evidence that Jesus actually meant what the gospel writers said, at least prima facie. I could go two ways here. I can talk about Mark 13:30, or I can talk about Matthew 10:23. Anybody have a preference on that?
I think probably since I was talking about Matthew 10, it's probably best to stick there for a second.
Okay, well, so there's this idea that Matthew is trying to defuse a bomb, and I'd just like to ask, like, what reason do we have to think that there's a bomb in the first place that needs to be diffused? Matthew 10:23 is only reported in Matthew, so we don't have any form of the saying which seems to be more apocalyptic or anything like that. As for the interpretation I gave in my video, I've actually changed my mind on this a little bit. So I don't want to get into all this, but I do think that this is probably a reference to the parousia, just given how Matthew tends to view the coming of the Son of Man phrase. I think when Matthew gives us this partially fulfilled picture of Daniel 7 and Matthew 28, it's not referring to the coming of the Son of Man part that's fulfilled. But that might be a later discussion. I think that in Matthew 10:23, we need to take into account the composite structure of the chapter. So you have verses 5 through 15. And by the way, each little section ends with an Amen Lego Humin saying, truly I say to you. So you have chapters 5 through 15, and these are separated from 16 through 23, and then so on, where you have various sayings of Jesus. Matthew 10:23, of course, falls right at the end of that 16 through 23 section. And what seems to distinguish that 16 through 23 section is that Matthew is now portraying this mission of the disciples as kind of a blueprint for how Matthew's community or Matthew's church should do this discipleship always. And it no longer becomes this only go to the towns of Israel thing. So the question is the mission as it's portrayed in 16 through 23, is that delimited? And I think that verse 23 of chapter 10, I think that instead of that verse cutting short the mission to Israel, I think it's lengthening the mission to Israel. Some translations translate Heos as until, or excuse me, as before. I think it's better translated until, and so you have a continuing mission, not a mission cut short. And I think this saying especially fits well with Matthew 23:39, where Jesus says, "You will not see me again until you," speaking to Israel, and then he quotes Psalm 118, "Say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." I have a hard time squaring that with the before reading, where verse 23 would seem to cut short the mission of Israel, and so on. So we have this saying only in Matthew's gospel. It seems that Matthew interprets it in a way that where Jesus is not predicting the end of the world within a generation, and so I don't find this to be especially problematic on my hypothesis. The Luke and Mark do portray the mission of the disciples differently than Matthew does, and I think it's because they're not portraying this as a blueprint for how discipleship should be universally and timelessly done. In fact, I think that there's actually evidence that Paul interpreted, in whatever form he had it, this mission discourse as being restricted to only those with perhaps an apostolic office or something like that. Those especially appointed in the church to do the task of evangelism. And I find that evidence in 1 Corinthians 9. And just because I haven't memorized the entire New Testament, I'm still going to have to go back there and read it. And this will be really quick, and then I'll let you respond. Sorry, I'm kind of monologuing here.
Oh, no, it's fine.
In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says, in the same way the Lord commanded, so he seems to be alluding to a Jesus tradition here. The Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel, it's limiting it to those who proclaim the gospel, should get their living by the gospel. And various commentators like Joseph Fitzmyer and so on see behind this verse the saying in the tradition, in the Jesus tradition, which pops up in Luke 10:7. And by the way, I mean, Matthew, you might deny the Pauline authorship of First Timothy, but the author of First Timothy, I think it's Paul, does quote Luke 10:7. The worker
It'll take
deserves
us way too far afield when if we get into authorship.
yeah, the worker deserves his wages, which is exactly what you find in Luke's portrayal of Jesus's mission to the disciples. And so I think there's some incidental, fairly early evidence that this mission of the disciples, where Jesus sends them out, was originally interpreted as something that was temporary and for only those who preach the gospel, rather than a universal thing or anything like that, or anything that demanded an interim ethic or something like that. I know there's a lot there. I'm sorry.
There was a lot there, and I don't want to, because we do need to move on. So I'll try not to just go back and forth on all of it. I do want to just make one quick response on just the point about kind of doing surgery on particular sayings in the Gospels, or kind of taking them out of the context to trying to determine, is this a standalone thing, or was it originally, did it originally come with the surrounding context and the oral tradition or whatever? Those kinds of questions, I think, are brought home by the fact that the different Gospels do move things around a lot. They have different sayings in different contexts. And I mean, you can't avoid kind of source critical questions when you look at something like Matthew 10, and Jesus sending out the disciples, and the fact that so much of what Jesus says in that chapter is verbatim what according to Mark 13 Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse. Talk about them being delivered over and persecuted by various authorities, but having the opportunity to bear witness, being empowered by the Spirit, family members turning against each other, quoting Micah 7, them being hated by all for his name's sake, but those who endure to the end will be saved. Like, all of those are things that come up in the Olivet Discourse, and that does beg the question, about those questions that kind of force you to do some surgery. But then you also have the fact that in the non-canonical Gospels, which I do think are less historically reliable than the canonical Gospels in general, they are later, and they obviously take things in directions that is it seems on a trajectory of reinterpretation that is much more drastic than the kinds of redactional changes that we see from one canonical Gospel to the next. However, something like the Gospel of Thomas, you have something like 2/3 of the Gospel of Thomas is parallel to things that Jesus says in the Synoptic Gospels, very close sayings that are just one or two words changed. And some of those changes are really, seemingly insignificant. You could read them as meaning essentially the same thing that the canonical Gospel writers do. Or they sometimes are more drastic and are taken in a more explicitly Gnostic direction. But if you're going to acknowledge the kind of redactional work and the kind of surgery on those individual sayings that you have in the non-canonical Gospels, obviously it just can't be an all or nothing thing, as Thomas is completely ahistorical. Because if you say Thomas is completely ahistorical and that he gets everything wrong, then you have to, of necessity, throw out a large chunk of the Synoptic Gospels that Thomas is drawing from. And so, it's a delicate thing, this kind of conversation. And I don't think that we can avoid having to try to get behind the text, or the way that the authors are situating these sayings of Jesus to the actual historical Jesus. I don't think that we can just assume that because Matthew was earlier than Thomas, that means Matthew got everything right. just as we can't assume that Thomas got everything wrong. And so that's the only point I'll make about that. But
okay. As much as I'd like to respond to that, we're about an hour here, so
yeah.
Your point has been noted. I'm not opposed to doing surgery. I won't say anything more.
Okay. So why don't we move to maybe some of the coping passages, since we kind of dealt a lot with the, this generation will see type of things. And so we do see things, particularly like in 2 Peter, which most scholars would acknowledge is later, although that is disputed and contested by some. So Matthew, what do you see when you're reading like something like 2 Peter, or maybe even some of Jesus' sayings after the resurrection to the Apostle Peter in John chapter 21? And then Bram, you could respond to kind of your view on those passages.
Well, just to clarify what we're talking about here, Bram in his presentation quotes Ehrman, and I think Ehrman puts it pretty clearly here. This is in his book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium. He says, some of the most clearly apocalyptic traditions come to be toned down as we move further away from Jesus's life in the 20s to the gospel materials produced near the end of the first century. And Bram says in his video that he sees no traceable toning down of eschatological expectation from the earlier writings to the later material. And I'd
just like to add a quick
go for it.
A quick qualification to that. What I don't see is a toning down as related to any failed predictions. That's you can acknowledge that there was a weakening, perhaps in eschatological enthusiasm, and some scholars have argued that you see a shift from an emphasis on imminence to an emphasis on more exhortation. But I'm speaking of toning down as it relates to failed predictions. So that's all I'll say. But
yeah. That's a helpful clarification. Although I think in the video you do mention this distinction between failure versus delay. And I don't know if is that what you're getting at here? Like that distinction between failure versus delay?
That's the distinction that
like the early church acknowledged some kind of a delay, but that's distinct from failure.
You can have delay in the sense of a delay from the human perspective, and you can have delay as it relates to the problem of theodicy. And this is something that Balcom has talked about in a really good article from the 70s.
It's an excellent article. Yeah.
That's quite
the delay of the Perusia, I think is the title of that piece.
Yeah. That's quite different from the problem of delay as it relates to dogmatic deadlines being set and those deadlines not having been met.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And in response to that, I think that I would say, first of all, I would say that I would reiterate anybody who can get their hands. I think it's at Richard Bauckham's website. But the title of that article is the delay of the Perusia, or the problem of delay or something like that. But it's an excellent article. Bauckam goes into Jewish prophetic history and shows how that problem of delay is something that isn't new to the New Testament or to the early church, but that the problem of delay was something that was with Israel from the prophets, from the earliest prophets that we have, through right up to the early church. And so they came to the delay of the Perusia, that they associated with the coming or the return of Jesus, equipped with a kind of toolbox for coping with that delay. But he wouldn't use exactly that language of coping, obviously. But to me, all that says to me, for Bauckam, it's that creates a strong point about how we shouldn't be discouraged or put off by the delay from the human perspective, because when you look at the tradition of the people of God, they've been grappling with theodicy, with the problem of evil, and asking God, "How long, O Lord?"
Exactly.
For as long as we have any traditions about that. But For me, that just accentuates the point, and I think probably anticipating some questions that you have asked before, Eric. But evidence of cognitive dissonance in the Bible, there it is. From when you have prophets like Habakkuk looking at an invading army, the Babylonians, and saying, "How long, O Lord? Like, where's the justice? Where is your promises?" Or something like Psalm 73. You have in many of the Psalms that same thing. That is evidence of dissonance, where their expectation of peace and prosperity, and of kind of the classic Deuteronomist perspective of, if you obey me, then you will have peace and prosperity and you will be blessed. When that wasn't happening, they had to grapple with that and find different explanations for that. And in much of the prophetic tradition, you find them finding new strategies for reducing dissonance over the problem of delay. But where from the outside you would speak of failure, from the inside, it is prophecy doesn't fail for believers. For the committed, prophecy never fails. It's only from the outside that you might speak of failure. But for the committed, there might be a delay, but it never fails. And so for me, that distinction between failure and delay is one of whether you're speaking from the outside or the inside, because obviously, if you're within the tradition, there's no such thing as failure.
I would definitely challenge that. I think that some delay is dissonance, but not all delay. Or excuse me, I'm getting all these terms mixed up. I think that some delay is failure, but not all delay is failure. So I think that much of the quote unquote delay, I think the Habakkuk kind of delay that you find in much of Jewish tradition and within the New Testament itself, isn't the kind of delay that appears between when something is dogmatically predicted to happen and when it actually does happen. I think it's the kind of delay that happens when the people of God pray for something to come about, when the people of God ask God to intervene, and when God actually does. I think those are two entirely different questions. And when we're asking the question of whether Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet, I think we can only be speaking in terms of whether Jesus dogmatically predicted the end of the world within his lifetime. So if Jesus said all these things will happen before this generation passed, and all these things was referring to the Parousia, that would be a definite failure. But
we do need to talk about the Olivet Discourse.
Yes, we do.
Because that point about all these things is, I think, really important.
Okay. Let's jump into that real quick. And then, Bram, I would like you to touch maybe after that on your view on 2 Peter, the conditional kind of view, because I think it's a little more unique, I would say, to some Christian theology. And then we'll open it up for some questions. And if we don't have questions, I have a few questions for you, and then we'll try and wrap up since we're about an hour in. But I'm willing to, we can go for about an hour and a half. So we still have another half hour. So
going too fast.
That just shows how big of a topic this is.
It's a huge topic.
Big. Yeah.
There's so much to say, and unfortunately, there's so much that we're going to leave out. But yeah.
Yeah. So, Bram, do you want to lay out your perspective on the Olivet Discourse? Because I think you make a lot of really good points about the all these things and what that refers to, and
Right. Well, let me just start out by saying that I agree with you. I just have to have the text in front of me because, again, I don't have this picture memory or anything like that. So I'm going to flip there. So let me just note some common ground here. I agree with you in your criticism of Wright. Wright in France take verses 24 through 27 as referring, or Wright calls it earth-shattering metaphorical language for the events of 70 AD. And I think, personally, the nail in the coffin for that thesis is the way that Paul uses the Olivet course material in 1 Thessalonians 4. And Matthew, that's a point that you've brought up, and I entirely agree. But the way I'd approach the question, I would start, I think, with the parable of the fig tree in verse 28 and following. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things, key phrase, taking place, you know that the word can be translated he, or it can be translated it, is near at the very gates. And then verse 30, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So again, I'm going to flip to my notes here. Sorry for the delay. Excuse the pun as well.
I guess we're used to delays.
Oh man.
Is it a delay or is it a failure?
I was about to ask. So I've got a few points here. I'm just going to rattle them off, if that's okay. One, in the Markan structure of this discourse, verses 5 through 23 are separated from verses 24 through 27 by, I think, an inclusio structure, bookended by the phrase these things in verse 4 and all things in verse 23. And when we come to verse 29 and verse 30, and we read these things and all these things, I think these refer back to the material within the inclusio. Two, the parable of the fig tree in verses 28 through 29 shows that when all these things take place, it means that the Son of Man or the temple destruction, again, depending on whether you translate it he or it, is near, not here.
Well, it could also refer to the coming of the kingdom, seeing as the coming of the Son of Man and the coming of the kingdom in a lot of these sayings are more or less interchangeable.
Sure. I'm fine with that. Point 3. So just to anticipate an objection on Matthew's part, some commentators have said, again, I have to go to the Markan text, I'm sorry. I just cannot keep this all in my head at once. Some commentators have said that, might grant my point about the parable of the fig tree and say, yeah, if all these things includes the Perusia, that makes verse 29 a tautology. But all these things doesn't stop at verse 23. It actually goes on to verse 24 and 25, and it includes the signs of the sun darkening, the moon not giving its light, the stars falling from heaven. And though these are signs which immediately precede the Son of Man, they're still included in all these things. Okay, that sounds plausible at first, but I think the nail in the coffin for that reading is one that George Beasley Murray makes especially well, and I'm ashamed that I didn't realize the point that Beasley Murray was making when I did my stream with Than. So this is kind of an update on my view on the Olivet Discourse. But anyway,
hot from the press.
Oh yeah, verses 24 through 27 are used in Jewish literature pretty much always as far as I can tell. They're used as accompaniments of God appearing and not precedents of his appearing, because they're portrayed as consequences of God stepping into his creation. And I think this makes it unlikely that they are part of the signs which precede the Son of Man's coming, or the things that will happen before this generation. These are part of the Son of Man's coming itself. These signs appear, starting in verse 24, these cosmic signs appear precisely because the Son of Man is stepping into the world for judgment. And just Beasley Murray gives quite a few references here. I went through all of them and checked them myself, and I can tell you they check out with flying colors. But just some interesting ones. My favorite is the Assumption of Moses 10:3, and that's a Jewish text. And what's cool about that one is it's very clear that the signs mentioned there occur precisely because God rises from his throne and comes down for judgment. But it's also cool because many of the cosmic signs mentioned parallel those in the Olivet Discourse. You see this in 1 Enoch 1:4-7, 4 Ezra. You see it in the Qumran literature. You see it in Sirach. You see it in Habakkuk. All the way back to the Old Testament, the Psalms, Judges, Amos, Micah, Nahum. You see it even in Revelation. And just for the references, if you want to read George Beasley Murray's book on Mark 13, the name escapes me right now. It's called Jesus in the Last Days, an interpretation of the Olivet Discourse. He talks about this on 307 through 309, pages 307 through 309. I know we're short on time here, but I'm just going to make one more point. There's a saying that follows the Olivet Discourse where Jesus says, only the Father knows the hour, and the Son doesn't know the hour. That's a terrible paraphrase, but that's the basic point. And the broadness of time indicators in verses 32 through 36, I think is a little bit hard to harmonize, if you will, with the reading of verse 30 that sees Jesus there delimiting the Parousia within a generation. And these indicators of time in verses 32 to 36 are very broad. It's you don't know the time, and you see parallel tradition here, like in Acts 1:6, where Jesus denies that we can know the times and seasons. And this is just the last point I'm going to make. What's especially interesting is that this language seems to be picked up in 1 Thessalonians, which Matthew and I agree uses a lot of this Olivet Discourse tradition. And in verses 1 through 2 of chapter 5 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul connects the times and seasons, same phrase that's used in Acts 1:6, with the unexpectedness or the unknowability of the time of the Parousia. He connects the times and seasons with the Lord coming like a thief in the night. And that echoes some of the stuff that you find in the Matthean Olivet Discourse of Jesus not knowing the hour, but instead coming like a thief in the night. And I think there's also in 1 Thessalonians a significant silence here regarding the delimitation of the Parousia to just a generation. But that I dumped a lot on you, Matthew, so if you want to respond to that, I'll...
No, that's great. I'm going to read a lot of my notes here so that I can stay on track, because you make a lot of really good points, and a lot of them I agree with. So the big question, does all these things in verse 30, when Jesus says all these things, that this generation won't pass away before all these things take place, does all these things only refer to the things prior to and leading up to the coming of the Son of Man? So the things in verses 5 to 23, and not the coming of the Son of Man itself. And to that, I would say very possibly. I don't have really any problem with that interpretation, but really I think it's entirely beside the point, because I think as the lesson of the fig tree and the image of birth pangs both illustrate, the logic of the connection between all these things and the coming of the Son of Man is that when you see things like false messiahs, wars and rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes, and the desolation of the temple, then you are meant to understand, as Mark says to the audience, winking to them, let the reader understand, you're meant to understand that the eschatological woes signaling the dawn of the age to come are in full force, and that you're about to witness the birth of God's new world. So trying to step into the shoes of Mark's audience, if the traditional dating of Mark is more or less on target, they're witnessing all of these things happening around them. And Mark is saying, hey, understand when you see these things happening, and notice that a lot of those things are pretty mundane. A lot of the things leading up to the cosmic disturbances in verse 24, 25, those things are things that you can look around and see right now. And that's why, a lot of dispensationalists, like I used to be, do just that. They say the world has never been more chaotic. There's never been famines and earthquakes and wars like we're witnessing today. But, in 66 to 70 AD, you could look around and definitely say, wow, things are getting really intense. And, Mark's point is that when you see these things beginning to take place, then you will know that the coming of the Son of Man, the final judgment, the end of all things, the culmination of history is just around the corner. And that's the connection between the two. But in support of this, 4th Ezra, an apocalypse written shortly after the destruction of Jerusalem, does something very similar to Mark 13. It's worth reading, I think, the whole passage here because of how close the parallel is. But the passage is 4th Ezra 8:63 through 9:4, and in this passage, Ezra, it's pseudonymous, but Ezra is asking God when the consummation of all things will occur. And he says, "Behold, O Lord, you have now shown me a multitude of the signs which you will do in the last times, but you have not shown me when you will do them." And the Lord answered me and said, "Measure carefully in your mind, and when you see that a certain part of the predicted signs are past, then you will know that it is that very time when the Most High is about to visit the world which he has made. So when there shall appear in the world earthquakes, tumults of people, intrigue of nations, wavering of leaders, confusion of princes, then you will know that it was of these that the Most High spoke from the days that were of old, from the beginning." I mean, there are several things to point out here, but notice how many of those predicted signs are virtually the same to what some of the signs that we find in Mark 13. They're classic tropes of the apocalyptic genre, because again and again throughout Israel's history, times of crisis were interpreted by prophetic and apocalyptic voices as signs of the end, and you can see that from Daniel on. But more importantly, notice how for Ezra, this "when you see, then you will know" formula, it works precisely because he and his audience, as most scholars agree, this was written just after 70 AD, that "when you see, then you will know" formula works precisely because he and his audience could look around and see that a certain part of the predicted signs had already happened. And so the point is that those predicted signs ensure that the eschaton is on schedule and it's just around the corner. And it seems to me that Mark's use of the fig tree analogy works in exactly the same thing. How he says, look at the fig tree and know that when you see the leaves becoming tender, then you know that the summer is near. When you see these things taking place, then you will know that the Son of Man and the kingdom of God are just around the corner. That's the point of that. And so I don't see any problem with seeing all these things as referring not to the coming of the Son of Man itself, but to the things leading up to the Son of Man. But the whole logic of the passage to me insists that all these things that Mark's audience could look around and see were happening is the point of that connection. The logic of it is that it guarantees that Jesus' coming is just around the corner. But regarding Jesus' confession of ignorance in verse 32, how he says, no one knows the day or the hour, not even the Son, only the Father knows. He says, I think it's worth noting that the takeaway point of the fact that nobody knows the exact day or hour is that they should stay alert and be ready. Now, later tradition has seen in these kinds of statements a kind of, a doctrine of perpetual imminence, that Jesus could literally come at any time. He could come tomorrow, he could come the next day, or he could come thousands of years in the future. But I think if you think about it, that really works against the sense of urgency that the text is really trying to provoke here, in context. This confession of ignorance is supposed to provoke in the reader this sense of it could come at any time from where we're standing, and so we need to be alert and ready. And it means that in a really concrete, this worldly sense, not in the way that I think the hindsight of 2,000 years of church history has taught us to read that as just being, well, it could happen at any time. But I also think, and this may lead us into your point about conditionality, but I think that if you interpret that confession of ignorance to be a general confession of ignorance of, not just, no one knows the exact time, but nobody knows nobody knows the millennium that it could happen in. I think that really does directly contradict what Jesus says in the verses immediately preceding that, where he actually does, I think, come down pretty dogmatically in saying that, this generation won't pass away until all these things take place. And he puts a huge emphasis on that point. He says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Like, take this to the bank. He's really insistent on that point. And so I think it's really hard to bring the conditionality point in and to see that as invalidating the belief that it really would come in that generation.
So, Bram, that was a lot to respond to, and I do think it ties well in, like Matthew said, to the later, well, to the passages in Second Peter and what have you. So, I'll let you respond, and then you could tie it into the conditionality view, and then Matthew can give like a real quick response, and then we'll wrap up. So, go for it, Bram. There was probably a lot to get at there.
Well, this might surprise you, but I actually don't have much of a problem of anything that you with anything that you said. I do think that there's this language of imminence is being used as what's the word, exhortational? Yeah, exhortational, because they're, the early Christians really do believe that Christ could come within their lifetimes. The question for me is, did they set dogmatic deadlines? That's the question I'm interested in. Now, regarding the parallel with 4 Ezra, yeah, I think that's an excellent parallel. It's actually one I read all through 4 Ezra last night just to get more of a feel for the apocalyptic in preparation for this. So I did notice that, and also noticed that I was aware of that passage because of the discussion you did with Dry Apologist. So yeah, but this is precisely where I think my unique conditional view of the Olivet Discourse comes in. I think on the Mount of Olives, Jesus was echoing the prophetic judgments of so many in the Old Testament, and made a conditional judgment. That is a judgment that was not so much about prognostication as it was activation, and activating people to properly respond with faith and repentance. And just to show you that this is not an attempt on my part to try to save Jesus or anything like that, I think, one, that this conditional view of judgment has very strong precedent in the Jewish tradition. And I think that there's abundant evidence within the Gospels and within other early Christian writings that the early Christians actually saw the eschaton in this way. So I hope you don't mind if I just walk through a few of these examples. Conditional timing of God's judgment in Judaism. You see this in Genesis, Judges, 2 Kings, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, Jonah. Jonah is a very famous example. God says, in so many days I'm going to destroy Nineveh. Nineveh ends up repenting, and God relents. You see this in Joel. You see it in Isaiah. Jeremiah, especially chapter 18. There you kind of get the blueprint for how many Jews understood God's judgment. God says, if at any time I declare judgment upon a nation, and that nation repents, I will relent with my judgment. You see it in chapter 26 as well. And many scholars actually argue that Jeremiah has kind of revised the Deuteronomistic view of prophecy. If you recall in Deuteronomy, one of the Mosaic laws is that if any prophet declares something that doesn't come to pass, that prophet is invalidated. You see this in Daniel, where I think it's chapter 4. You know Daniel probably better than I do, but if I recall correctly, in Daniel chapter 4, God gives a judgment against Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel is kind of relaying that message, and then Daniel adds, this is his own little footnote. He asked Nebuchadnezzar to repent so that there might be a lengthening of his prosperity. You see this in the rabbis. Many rabbinic passages have it that the Son of David will not come until Israel repents. You see this in earlier pseudepigraphical texts, Testament of Daniel and so on, Assumption of Moses. You see it in Qumran. There's a lot of evidence. And it should be noted that not all of these passages make a judgment's conditionality explicit. Jonah doesn't. You don't see that in Genesis 2:17. You don't see it in 2 Kings 21-6. You don't see it in 2 Samuel 12-22. And in many cases, the people looking at this prophecy just assume that it's conditional. They just treat it like it's conditional, as if that's not questioned. the most important part is where does this conditional idea of judgment show up in the New Testament? And I think there are quite a few places. I think in Matthew 23, when Jesus is looking over Jerusalem, and he says, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Dale Allison actually has a really good paper on that he wrote back in the 80s, where he argues that this is a conditional prophecy. And because of Jesus's quotation of Psalm 118, it implies that Jesus will not come back until Israel repents freely and with joy, not the kind of repentance that occurs too late for the coming destruction. I think you see it in Luke 19. Jesus says, "Would you have known the things that make for peace?" I think you see it in the fig tree parable in Luke 13. I think it makes a lot of sense of Jesus telling his disciples to pray so that the kingdom might come. And within the Olivet Discourse itself, I think there are two places which make this reading plausible. First, in Mark 13:10, and the gospel must be first proclaimed to all nations. I think that puts the timing of the parousia and makes it contingent upon human behavior. And I think you see that same kind of tradition show up in Romans 11 as well. I think where Jesus says in verse 18, "Pray that it may not happen in winter." Well, interestingly enough, if you think that Mark was written after AD 70, this is especially puzzling because the temple destruction didn't happen in winter. It happened in summer. I think you see it in the early tradition like Acts 3:19 through 21, where I think it's Peter talking, and he says that we need to repent, or y'all need to repent, so that the times of refreshing may come. I'm from the South. I forget that that not everybody says y'all. So
I could see a Southern Peter.
That's the King Jimmy right there.
Oh yeah.
Why he has that dream of a big Southern feast full of all these delicious
fried okra and anyway.
I'm almost done here.
Yep.
I think you also see it in the patristics where you have Tertullian saying we need to pray for our kings and our magistrates, and we need to pray for the delay of the final consummation. I think you see it in Justin Martyr. I think you see it in the Shepherd of Hermas and in Ignatius and so on. So my point is that this is a widespread tradition, and this is a widespread view of the parousia. And I think this makes it unlikely that 2 Peter, the author of 2 Peter, is when he says that his congregation needs to be have ethical, moral behavior so that they might hasten the day of the coming of God. I don't think there's good reason for thinking that 2 Peter there is coming up with this creative explanation to explain the delay of the parousia. I think he's relaying a view of the timing of the parousia that Jesus himself actually took, in line with Jewish tradition before him, and which the early church and the patristic writers followed. So thanks for giving me my monologue there.
Yeah.
No, it's good. Matthew, do you want to briefly respond to that?
Yeah, I have to say, for starting at the end where you're talking about 2 Peter, it's interesting because I was a part of a community, actually an heavily apocalyptic community for a number of years, where like we believed not just that Jesus was going to come back in this generation, but that we were like kind of specially called to hasten the timing of his return, that through fasting and prayer and lifestyles of extreme devotion, that we were called to do exactly what 2 Peter 3 says, and that we were supposed to prepare the way of the Lord, and not just prepare it, but that through our prayers, like the widow in the praying for justice, is like, we were gonna make God say, "Oh God, okay, I'll come," like just. But what's interesting is that, at least in our minds, as an apocalyptic community, the understanding that the day of the Lord could be hastened never seemed to conflict with our belief that it was going to come in this generation. And we had a way of kind of harmonizing this view of the sovereignty of God with the free response of mankind. And I think in a lot of gospel traditions, and when you get later into rabbinic traditions, and I think Romans 9-11 is a really good example of this, where Paul is talking about the salvation of Israel, and he talked about how Israel has been hardened so that the Gentiles could come in, but that all Israel will eventually be saved. And he kind of talks about it all as being, just like God is playing this master chess game where he has ordained things, playing this game so that, mankind's free choices work out in favor of the plan that he has orchestrated. And I think you have, a great example of that with the way that the Gospels deal with Judas. It's that, Judas, he was supposed to betray Jesus. The way that they talk about it is like this was sovereignly ordained, but at the same time, it was Judas's free choice. And
Yep.
in Jewish tradition, especially later Jewish tradition, you have a lot of grappling with that and trying to harmonize that. But going earlier, and I think part of the problem I have, I forget who's the author of when the Son of Man didn't come, because that's his big thesis.
Christopher Hayes.
Christopher Hayes, which I haven't read all of it, but the parts that I've read were excellent. But my biggest objection to using conditionality as kind of the overarching explanatory kind of hermeneutical principle to deal with these things is that the apocalyptic tradition in particular seems to move away from that earlier view of the prophets. If you're talking about Jeremiah and you have Jeremiah 18, and I mean, you talk about how Jeremiah 18 seems to kind of be engaging with the Deuteronomic view of prophecy as, if someone prophesies something and it doesn't come to pass, then that person was a false prophet. But the way Jeremiah 18 deals with that is by drawing on the Deuteronomic. I always have a problem saying Deuteronomic versus Deuteronomist or versus Deuteronomistic. But drawing on that tradition from Deuteronomy 28, where God said, lays out blessings and curses and says, if you follow me, you will receive blessings. If you do not follow my words, then you'll receive all of these curses. And Jeremiah 18 is just kind of extending that, applying that to prophecy and saying, yeah, whenever the Lord says anything like he's going to bless a nation, if that nation turns from him, he won't send the blessings, he'll send the curses, and vice versa. And that works for a lot of the earlier prophets. But when you get into the apocalyptic tradition, if you ever read kind of overview of the apocalyptic genre, one of the things you'll read about is determinism, and how determinism is such a strong feature of apocalyptic. And it's I think because part of the thing that generated the apocalyptic tradition was a dissatisfaction with that older contingent view because of, say, the Babylonian exile and Antiochus Epiphanes, and the fact that righteous Jews were suffering, and they couldn't say, well, this is because of our sin that we're suffering, because we're faithful, like we're looking at ourselves, we're being honest with ourselves, and this just can't be judgment for our sin that we're not receiving the blessings of the Lord, and instead we're constantly being led around like cattle. And you actually have an engagement with that view in Isaiah 53, the famous suffering servant passage, where you have that older voice where people are saying, oh, it's because of his sin, and he's saying, no, it's not because of anything, any sin, but it's so that I might lead others to Yahweh, that I've been suffering. And so his suffering becomes redemptive instead of being a judgment on him for not following. But I think the classic expression of that kind of determinism is when at the end of the book of Revelation, and it's a line that is very prominent in one of my favorite Johnny Cash songs, When the Man Comes Around. But it's let those who are righteous be righteous still. Let those who are wicked be wicked still. And he says to John, the angel says to John, don't close the book, which is the exact opposite of what the angel tells Daniel, with the implication being that this is just around the corner. people are going to do what people do. Basically, the gates have closed, and the righteous are going to become more set in their ways. The wicked are going to become more set in their ways, and it's all a part of the sovereign purpose of God. But going into the gospel specifically, so a lot of this hinges on the degree to which you see Jesus as a prophet in just the older prophetic tradition like Jeremiah, or whether you see him in the later post-exilic and apocalyptic tradition that became more deterministic. And like in the book of Daniel, where you have calculations being made, Daniel is engaging with the older prophetic tradition, and he actually starts making calculations. It's going to be 1,260 days. It's going to be 1,335 days. It's going to be 3.5 years, and this is going to happen. And I think when you ask that question, I think the answer that comes back most clearly is that Jesus was profoundly influenced by the apocalyptic tradition, and that's why you get in Mark 13:30, when Jesus says this generation won't pass away, he is so emphatic about saying, my words will not pass away, and he does seem to be pretty dogmatic. But looking at the end of Matthew 23, where he says the passages that you mentioned of I longed to gather you, but you were not willing. He says, you won't see me again until you say, blessed is you comes to the name of the Lord. I would just note that is not said in a contingent way, but it's said as a statement, not as a question of, if you don't turn to me, then I won't come back until, or then then I won't gather you until. But he says, no, this is the way it's going to go down. I'm going, you won't see me again until you do this. And I think a similar thing is with the good news must first be proclaimed to all the nations, and then the end will come, in Mark 13:10. Those are said as statements. And I think that if, there is an element of contingency in that, I think it's similar to the later rabbis, or to the way that Paul deals with the free will of man and the sovereignty of God in Romans 9-11, where man's free will is a piece on the table that God is using in his chess game to bring about the plan that he has sovereignly ordained. And it doesn't really, to use it as a way of explaining things not happening the way that we priorly expected, or saying that, it was always contingent, just smacks to me like a rationalization, a dissonance reduction strategy that doesn't seem to come into play until things don't play out the way you expected they would.
There's a lot to respond to there. Eric, how much time do we have?
We're already 7 minutes over, but I'll give you, since I gave Matt about 8 minutes there, I'll give you 5 real quick to respond to that, if that's okay. And then we'll take some questions and we'll wrap up.
Well, yeah, so it's precisely the question, how, you said there are two sides to the way, or two sides to this tension between determinism on the one hand and contingency on the other. But it's precisely the point in dispute how the determinism side of that relates to passages like Mark 13:30, Mark 9:1, and so on, and whether part of that dogmatic expectation was the parousia coming within the lifetime of Jesus and his early followers. And it's precisely that I dispute. I mean, of course, I think we see Jesus, and I think we see Paul and all the other Christians and the Jews before and after wrestling with this tension between determinism and contingency. But I don't think you can use that to shed much light on whether Jesus dogmatically predicted the end of the world within his own lifetime without a careful analysis of the passages in question. Regarding the 2 examples that I gave for conditional prophecy in Jesus's words, Matthew 23:39 and Mark 13:10. Yes, they're said as statements, but I think they're said as conditional statements. And I think Allison's paper on Matthew 23 39 does a great job of comparing how the structure of that statement and also its Lucan parallel is so close to statements of conditional prophecy that you see, for example, in the later rabbis and some of the intertestamental literature. So I didn't hear anything, at least off the top of my head, that would make me reject the interpretation of those passages that I take. My argument is that if this conditional view of the parousia is present from the ministry of Jesus, it's not a rationalization or an attempt to save Jesus to use it as an explanation for the New Testament data. As my argument would be, the Christian theology itself from day one, and the source of Christian theology, Jesus himself, provided us with the tools and resources to explain these without having to resort to strained or ad hoc hypotheses. So.
All right. Well, we are at the hour and 40-minute mark, which is about 10 minutes past, so not too bad at all. Do have a couple of questions real quick. Super chat, where'd you go? So this is from our friend Derek at Myth Vision. I love this topic. Thank you guys for the discussion. If Jesus and Paul was wrong, would you still remain, or were wrong, I guess he corrected himself later, would you still remain a Christian, Mr. Rawlings? So, Bram, go ask your dad what Mr. Rawlings thinks. And so, no, what do you think, Bram?
I think that if Jesus dogmatically predicted absolutely the return of, or his second coming within a generation, and not only that, but that he incorporated his entire ethic and entire teaching and ministry around that fact, I think I'd have to say I can't be a Christian anymore. And there's where I agree with Matthew. I think that C.S. Lewis, when he, admitted that he thought that Jesus was wrong, I think he undervalued that connection between, Jesus's ministry and the actual eschatological elements of it. And I don't think those two things can be detached. And if, moreover, if Schweitzer and so on are right, that that this produced in Jesus's teaching a kind of interim ethic, I wouldn't know what to make of any of Jesus's teachings, because they would be founded on something that just simply failed. So I couldn't remain a Christian at that point. Now, if Paul was wrong about it, or later Christians, I don't see why I'd have to give up my Christian faith after that. I just have to change some of my views on what it means for Scripture to be inspired and so on. But that's about it.
Okay. And then Matthew, Myth Vision again. I think you got yourself an invite
Let's
by
do
your
it.
Performance here. So
Heck yeah.
Derek, slide up into Matthew's DMs and he's down.
Derek, I want one too.
Yeah, there you go.
Part two. Here we go.
There you go. Here's Caleb, our buddy Caleb here. Matthew, if the disciples believed that they were living in the end times, why didn't they argue other Christians had also been resurrected along with Jesus as further proof of the tribulation?
Well, that's really interesting, because that's something that Matthew seems to do, actually. In Matthew 27, it seems like he associates the death and resurrection of Jesus with the apocalypse, or with the dawn of the age to come, in some sense. And in order to strengthen that connection, he talks about people coming out of their graves and going around and being seen by many in Jerusalem. Many of the saints were raised, and that's all we hear about it. And that's not, you don't see that in any of the other Gospels or anything. But it does seem like for Matthew, that connection, which is not, it's not that Matthew was the only one who saw, who understood the death and resurrection of Jesus eschatologically. Mark makes a number of, has a number of things in his passion narrative, or the pre-Markan passion narrative, that seem to point in that direction as well. But Matthew seems to make that connection even stronger by talking about those saints coming out of the graves. But that, I think, is also part of the point of Paul's language that he uses in 1 Corinthians 15 in talking about Jesus' resurrection as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. He's seeing Jesus as the Messiah, as the representative of all of God's people, as kind of the first sprout of grain at the beginning of the harvest season, or the first, flower of spring, anticipating the general resurrection, or being the first stage of a two-stage general resurrection. And I think the meaning of that for Paul was that the general resurrection is just around the corner. And so I think that connection is very strong in the New Testament.
Okay. And then I think we got one more here. Once again, Derek, thank you for the super chat, 3 super chats. And so best points you guys each learned from each other. And I think that would be a really good place to probably end it on.
Yeah. Awesome.
So Bram, you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that Matthew connecting his personal experience with, let me rephrase this. Matthew using his personal experience to show how one can hold together the concept of the timing of the eschaton being conditional on human behavior, as well as there being something deterministic about it. I think that was really interesting and insightful. There, I just, I'd question the extent to which the determinism of the New Testament actually relates to these dogmatic predictions. That's what's in dispute. And I also thought that his comments on Mark 13 and relating that closer to the eschatological woes that you see in other apocalyptic literature, I thought that was insightful as well.
Okay, Matthew.
Bram, I think the thing I'm most impressed with you is, there were a lot of specific points that you made, and I'm definitely going to be listening to this again and to try and pick up, because there was a lot of things you said. I was like, oh wait, can you just say that again? And for the sake of time, I didn't want to interrupt, but you made a ton of really good points. But I think in general, the energy that you have for this subject is inspiring. And I, the not only the energy, but the ethos that you carry in the way that you approach this subject is very, very commendable. And I just applaud you for being so concerned with following the evidence wherever it leads. And I'm excited to see what you come out with in the future. I want to hear what you say.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, and I think this sums it up well, and I definitely could agree. Thank you guys for a good conversation, exploring reality. Bram had a longer stream, about this long. If you want to check out kind of Bram's full case, he goes over a host of passages that we weren't even able to discuss, particularly from the Pauline literature, which I really wanted to get to, but unfortunately we weren't able to. So definitely check it out. I will put a link in the description. But he says, very good job, very good faith conversation, very enjoyable. And as a host, I definitely couldn't agree more. And so I appreciate it. There's so much more that I want to get into. Again, my Matthew tripped my maximalist brain a little bit here.
Right at the beginning.
Yeah. And I was like, oh man, there's so many ways that I would tackle this question that I think, and I think Bram would probably agree, that would enhance, because if you can make a robust case for the reliability of the Gospels, then I think it makes like a case
has implications. It's all connected. Yeah.
Yeah. And if your case of where the Gospels are probably maybe less reliable and have accretions and embellishments and different things like that, then I think that makes your case all the much more stronger. And so I think there's a lot of action here in this particular debate, as well as there's just a lot of action just surrounding it that maybe we'll hopefully be able to discuss in the future.
Probably why this has generated so much research. It's been a good project.
Absolutely.
Three things which are not related to each other, just to cap this off. One of them, I need to go to my bookshelf and pull out some books really quick. So let me do that.
Uh-oh, Bram's running to the bookshelf here. Real quick, Exploring Reality, All Apologists Are Dishonest. That's right. Those dishonest apologists.
Regarding not only the topic of early Christian eschatology, but also, as Eric just talked about, regarding the question of gospel reliability. If you are a Christian and you want to interact with scholarship that will challenge you, Matthew will fully agree. I highly recommend reading Dale Allison. Dale Allison, more than any other writer, at least from, well, I'll just say it this way. Dale Allison, more than any other New Testament scholar, has challenged me in various ways and has got me thinking along different lines and so on. So if you're a Christian and you want to interact with scholarship that you probably don't want to agree with in the end, I highly recommend reading Dale Allison. I'm sure Matthew's collection of Allison is much bigger than mine, but
I was just going to recommend starting with Allison's first book, which of all of Allison's work is probably his most neglected. But the title of the book is "The End of the Ages Has Come," and it's a study of the passion narratives and the eschatology that the early church associated with Jesus' death and resurrection. But phenomenal book, and it really sets you up to kind of understand later Allison in a really helpful way. Right?
So Matthew, real quick on that note, who do you recommend that your fellow like skeptics read, as far as like who would challenge their view from maybe a Christian standpoint?
I gotta simp N.T. Wright. He, honestly, Wright, to me, I would much rather read someone who I think asks good questions and generates thinking than someone who has all the answers. And Wright continues to be someone for me who, because of his creativity and his just vitality in just producing so much work, he is someone that you have to engage with from any side. I think that, when I first started reading Wright, he was seen as being kind of slightly outside the evangelical fold by a lot of my more conservative friends. But I think that something has happened just in the last decade where he has really become the lead scholar of evangelical, quote unquote, kind of orthodox or traditional faith. And his arguments in favor of the historicity of the resurrection, his engagement with the alternative views is just stimulating. So I would definitely recommend Wright. He's got a newer book. Let me just grab this. Sorry. This one, History and Eschatology. It is the subtitle is Jesus and the Promise of Natural Theology, but it goes along really well with what we've been talking about today, because a lot of Wright's whole project is kind of engaging with trying to give a holistic alternative to Schweitzer's view of Jesus. And I think it's the one to be reckoned with. But this book is a really good, I think, encapsulation of Wright's whole project that deals with it from a more philosophical angle, but is definitely stimulating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Go ahead, Brian.
I just had one quick. That's okay. A really good essay from Wright on the whole delay of the Parousia question is an article he wrote called "Hope Deferred Against the Dogma of Delay." That's hope deferred with a question mark afterwards. It's about 45 to 50 pages, and it engages with Schweitzer's work. It engages with Johannes Weiss, as well as Allison, not so directly though. So I highly recommend reading that essay. And by the way, I don't mean to hog the conversation, but the second thing I was going to say is I'm really disappointed we didn't get to talk about the whole redactional coping theory.
Yeah, me too.
Which is a part
Huge
of
part of it. Yep.
And a huge part of where I disagree with him. So just showing you that there's a lot more to
Part two.
Yep.
So, all right, guys. Well, yeah, I wish we could have got to more. We're at 2 hours, and like I feel like we're just kind of scratched the surface. And so, I guarantee you, if you're watching this, you didn't get all of this, and so go back, watch it again, and because there's a lot. Like I said, Bram has a lot that he discussed on exploring reality. So be sure to check that stream as well. Also, Matthew has his blog. Matthew, is it just MatthewHartke.com? Is that correct? The URL.
You know,
are you still
I'm not active on there? I haven't written anything in ages.
Okay.
Basically, since I finished school, I have had writer's block, and hopefully I'll be writing more in the future. But man, life.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, real life always tends to kind of get in the way. Well, check him out on future appearances, perhaps on Myth Vision. And so. But yeah, Matthew's definitely got a lot to say. He's got some videos on his YouTube channel, which he's has updated somewhat sporadically. I hope you do get back on there, Matthew, because your content is, I would say, as far as from the skeptical side of things, my favorite content to interact with. So thank you so much for joining us, gentlemen, and you guys have a good rest of your night.